What if the secret to elite mastery isn't endurance, but micromechanics? We're bypassing the big picture overwhelm to obsess over tiny, high-impact victories that prove you're getting better every single minute. Discover the micro-mastery method, a way to transform grueling practice into a sequence of effortless, systematic, and rapid success. Section 1. The Quiet Frustration. There is a very specific kind of afternoon that most people who are trying to learn something difficult will recognize. You've opened the book again, or you've pulled up the course, or you've sat down at the instrument, or in front of the blank screen, or beside the language app you promised yourself you'd commit to this time. And for a few minutes, maybe even 30, you try. You really do. And then, without a dramatic announcement, you've drifted. You're not sure how. You're checking something that felt urgent, you're reorganizing your workspace, you're thinking about whether you're even cut out for this, whether the people who do it well were always different from you, whether starting this late even makes sense. And the cruel part is that you'll interpret this as a personal failure, as laziness or weakness, or the confirmation of some quiet suspicion you've carried about yourself. But here's what's actually happening in that moment, and it's worth saying carefully because most people have never heard it this way. You are not failing to learn. You are experiencing the entirely normal collision between a brain designed for survival and a task designed for growth. These two things are fundamentally at odds, and nobody told you that. They just handed you the syllabus and called it discipline. Section 2. The Myth We Inherited. There is a story that runs very deep in almost every culture that has a word for success, and the story goes something like this. Talent is something you are born with. Discipline is something noble people possess. If learning feels hard, that's information about your ceiling, and if someone mastered something quickly, it means they were built for it. This is not just unhelpful. It is, in the light of what we now understand about how brains actually change, demonstrably wrong. We've inherited a model of intelligence that was largely crystallized in the early 20th century, one that imagined the mind as a fixed instrument, like a piano that either has the right keys or doesn't. Howard Gardner spent a significant portion of his academic life methodically dismantling that assumption. He wasn't just arguing that people are smart in different ways, which is the oversimplified version most people remember. He was making a deeper claim, that intelligence is not a single trait, but a constellation of capacities, and that most educational systems are calibrated to recognize only 2 or 3 of them, which means most people graduate having been told, in very polite institutional language, that they are less capable than they actually are. Meanwhile, Benjamin Bloom was doing something quietly revolutionary in the field of educational psychology. He was studying what happened when students were given enough time, the right instructional conditions, and meaningful feedback. What he found was uncomfortable for anyone invested in the myth of innate talent. The vast majority of students, given those conditions, performed at the level that only the top 5% reached under standard schooling. His conclusion was not that everyone is the same. It was that most people never get the conditions they need to discover what they're actually capable of. These two lines of thinking, held together, suggest something important. The problem is rarely the learner. The problem is almost always the method. Section 3. How your brain actually learns. Think of the brain not as a filing cabinet, but a living garden. Information doesn't get stored, it gets grown. And like anything that grows, it requires the right conditions, a certain patience with slowness, and the understanding that most of the meaningful change happens underground before you can see any of it. When you sit down to practice a new skill and feel like nothing is happening, something is almost certainly happening. Neural pathways are being laid with extraordinary delicacy, like roots pushing through soil you can't observe. The brain is not a machine that registers input and produces output in the same session. It's a biological system that consolidates learning during rest, during sleep, during the moments when you have stepped away and are no longer trying. The reason pushing harder doesn't work the way we expect it to comes down to a concept worth understanding not as a technical term, but a lived experience. When your brain is holding too many things at once, it starts to triage. It begins dropping pieces of information the way you'd lighten a backpack on a very long hike. This isn't weakness. This is the nervous system protecting itself. And when the material you're learning is both complex and emotionally loaded, which learning is almost always is, the cognitive weight becomes even heavier because you're not just processing information, you're simultaneously managing what that information means about you. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was famous for something his colleagues sometimes found eccentric. He refused to study anything he couldn't explain simply. Not because he was simplistic, but because he understood something essential about real comprehension. If you can only hold a concept while it's wrapped in its original technical packaging, you don't actually understand it yet. You've memorized its shape. That's different. And that distinction between the shape of knowledge and the substance of it is exactly where most self-directed learners get stuck. Section 4. What the micro-mastery method actually is. The micro-mastery method is not a productivity system. It is not a hack. It is a reorientation of attention. The central principle is this. Instead of measuring your progress against where you want to be, you measure it against where you were 1 hour ago. Instead of practicing a skill in its full, overwhelming complexity, you identify the smallest independently learnable unit within that skill, and you master that unit completely before moving forward. Imagine you're learning to speak a new language. The traditional approach is to set a goal, achieve conversational fluency. The micro-mastery approach asks something different. What is the single smallest linguistic structure you can internalize today, use correctly in 3 different sentences, and feel genuinely confident about by the end of this session? Not fluency, one structure, owned completely. This is not about lowering ambition. It is about understanding how confidence actually accumulates. Confidence is not something you decide to feel. It is something your brain manufactures as a response to evidence. Every small, concrete, undeniable demonstration that you are getting better produces a small chemical signal that makes further learning not just possible, but motivating. You are not tricking yourself. You are working with the architecture of the mind rather than against it.
Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, not for publication but for himself, about the importance of doing the next right thing rather than attempting to seize the whole of a life's worth of virtue in a single decision. He was describing, in the language of Stoic philosophy, something that modern behavioral psychology would eventually formalize. Large goals generate anxiety, small specific actions generate momentum. And momentum, once real, tends to sustain itself. Section 5. The identity dimension. There is a layer to this that goes deeper than technique, and it would be dishonest to talk about mastery without touching it. When you try to learn something and struggle, the struggle rarely stays at the level of skill. It migrates inward. It becomes a story. And once it becomes a story, it stops being about the skill and starts being about who you are and what you're allowed to become. Carl Jung spent much of his life exploring the gap between who we believe we are and who we actually have the capacity to be. He called the unlived parts of our potential the shadow, not because they are dark, but because they live in the parts of ourselves we haven't turned the light on yet. The person who has told themselves they are not a writer, not a musician, not a mathematical thinker, has not discovered a truth about themselves. They've found an identity that protects them from the vulnerability of trying. This is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a judgment, simply as an honest question. What is the skill you've decided isn't for you? And when did you decide that? And was that decision really about your capacity, or was it about a moment of early difficulty that felt like evidence and wasn't? The micro-mastery method works partly because it is gentle enough not to trigger that defense. When the unit of practice is small enough, the identity is not at stake. You are not attempting to become a pianist today. You are spending 20 minutes understanding how a single chord transition feels under your hands. That's manageable, that's honest, and over time, honestly accumulated, those 20-minute sessions build a person who plays piano. Not because they decided to become one, but because they kept showing up for small, true moments of learning. Section 6. The resistance is information, not an obstacle. Almost everyone who has tried to build a complex skill has encountered the wall. That moment when progress seems to stall, when the thing that felt like it was finally clicking stops clicking, when motivation drains without warning, and the whole endeavor starts to feel somehow pointless or naive. The standard cultural response to this moment is to push harder, to discipline yourself through it, to remember why you started and harness that into forward momentum. This works for some people some of the time, but for many people it does something subtler and more damaging. It trains them to associate learning with suffering, and the brain, which is exquisitely efficient at avoiding pain, starts to create very small, very believable reasons to avoid the practice entirely. The more useful approach, and the one rooted in what we understand about how motivation actually functions, is to treat resistance as information. When you don't want to practice, that resistance is telling you something specific. It might be telling you that the unit you're working on is still too large and needs to be broken down further. It might be telling you that your nervous system needs rest before it can absorb more. It might be telling you that you've been learning without any feedback mechanism, and the absence of feedback has made the whole endeavor feel invisible and therefore meaningless. Confucius said something that has been translated many ways, but essentially means this: it doesn't matter how slowly you go, as long as you don't stop. What he understood, and what the modern science of spaced repetition confirms, is that the intervals matter as much as the effort. A learner who practices a skill for 20 minutes, rests, returns 2 days later, and repeats that cycle will outperform a learner who spends 4 hours in a single exhausted session. Not slightly, dramatically. The rest is not the absence of learning. The rest is where the learning takes root. Section 7. The deeper truth. Here is the thing that everything in this conversation has been quietly moving toward. Mastery is not about becoming exceptional. It is about becoming honest. The person who truly masters a skill has not conquered it. They have had enough quiet, consistent, truthful contact with it that the skill has become part of how they see the world. The architect doesn't just design buildings. They move through spaces differently because of what they know. The musician doesn't just perform. They hear differently. The writer doesn't just produce sentences. They notice things that others walk past. This is what Benjamin Bloom was pointing at when he argued that most people are capable of mastery. He wasn't making a motivational claim. He was making an epistemological one, that real learning changes not just what you can do, but how you perceive, and perception, once changed, cannot be unchanged. The micro-mastery method, at its heart, is simply a way of earning those changes in perception gradually enough that the brain can absorb them, specifically enough that you can tell you're making progress, and honestly enough that the process doesn't require you to pretend to be someone you're not. You don't need to be relentless. You need to be precise and patient and willing to pay attention to what is actually in front of you today instead of performing a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet. That's a different kind of hard, but it's a much more sustainable one. If something in this video felt true to you, I'd ask you not to rush past it. The next video in this series goes deeper into how identity shapes what we allow ourselves to learn, and how to work with that shaping rather than against it. It's a conversation about the stories we carry into practice, and the quiet, undramatic process of revising them. Not because you need to be fixed, but because clarity is worth having. When you're ready, it'll be there.